Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here bright and early. So I'm going to give an overview as to where we are in regards to using salt marsh as geological tide gauges. This is work that's been done with a number of groups, but in particular work that I've done associated with Anthony Long at Durham University and Roland and Margot now at the University of York, who are both here sat in the front. So why do we need to do this work? Well, it was alluded to several times during yesterday. We have sea level index points associated with Holocene sea level change, which tell us about rise of sea level following deglaciation. And with the audience here, I don't need to tell you what a tide gauge does, but the bit that we're interested in is the overlap. So a lot of Holocene sea level data is unable to constrain sea level during the last 2,000 years. And we need to see how those two data sets fit over the top of each other. So there's been a push to develop salt marsh reconstructions, such as this one here, and fit these with the tide gauge data. And Amy raised this point yesterday. They can help us to understand whether the current rate of sea level change is unusual. So if we cast our minds back to AR4, this is the sort of data that was included. There was some archaeological data from the Mediterranean, from the Roman and from a period and from the Israeli coast, and a few data sets developed by Roland and Jeff Donnelly. But in general, the amount of data included in that report was limited. This archaeological data, this is the numbers from Kurt Lambeck's paper, tell us about sea level about 2,000 years ago. But they are unable to fill the gaps in between. And sea level may have been stable, or it may have had a number of fluctuations. This data has the potential to be able to tell us about spatial patterns of sea level change, either associated with mass balance of the ice sheets and mountain glaciers, or dynamic ocean topography. And as a result, there's been a drive to develop records from around the North Atlantic to understand these spatial patterns. So the sites here in green are sites that we've been working on under our project, and I'm going to show some data from, I think, pretty much all of these sites, actually. The group led by Andy Kemp with Ben Horton have been working on sites down here in the southern part of North America. The record from Andy Kemp from North Carolina has also already been shown a couple of times in this meeting. We also have salt marsh data from up on the Greenland margin from work that Anthony Long and Sarah Woodruff at Durham have been doing. And I'm going to also refer to two records from Portugal and northern Spain. So I thought I'd just include a slide that related to discussions on Sunday for those of us who were on the field trip. This is the salt marsh at Parkgate that Andy Plater and Jason Kirby took us to. And on first view, it looks like it would be, it'd be a very useful marsh for developing salt marsh records. However, as they pointed out to us, this is a photograph from 1939 where we can see there is actually no salt marsh vegetation at this area of the coast. This salt marsh vegetation has developed in association with changes in tidal sedimentation due to changes in channel migration for shipping and such like. So we need to be quite careful on where we select our sites. So it's not always possible to develop long salt marsh records from sites all around the world. But the sites I showed you on the previous graph, we're quite confident have decent sea level records in them. So considering the audience, I thought it would be good to give an overview as to how salt marsh reconstructions are developed. I know some people you'll be aware of, but it kind of gives you a background as to how this work is done. So there's four parts. First of all, we need to understand the modern coastal environment. That's quite critical. We then have to construct a fossil archive, and then we can use that data to produce a quantitative reconstruction of past sea level. And then the final bit is developing an age model to understand the timing of these changes. So this is a typical salt marsh zone. We have tidal flat environments and an increase in vegetation as the occurrence of tidal inundation decreases. As you get above the highest astronomical tide, you end up in freshwater environments. And across these salt marshes, we get distributions of diatoms, as is shown here, and also foraminifera. And their distribution is controlled by this tidal inundation. We can go into the marsh and we can take samples from a range of points across this modern environment, and we can relate them to elevation and produce a simple model which statistically relates. And this is when you hear the transfer functions. This is a transfer function. You see that in the literature. Step 2, go to salt marsh, and we need to now understand the fossil environment. This is a site here we've been working on recently from northwest Scotland, Loch Laxford, right up on, it's about 40 kilometres south of Cape Wrath. And we've done a series of cores through this marsh to understand how the sedimentation has built up over time. That's important because cores from here will record different sea level to cores from here. We get a full high marsh peak development, whereas we only get a very small amount of peak development here. And an important part of developing sea level reconstructions is that any particular reconstruction is very much a function of local sedimentation. We need to choose a core that's representative of that site, and ideally, if resource allows, produce replicate results. And doing that, we can then show the signal away from the local inter-site noise. So this is our core from Loch Laxford, and through there we've done a number of diatom analysis. You don't need to worry about the detail, it's just to show that we take samples at typically 1 or 2 centimetre resolution down that core. We then use our modern transfer function that I showed in a previous slide. And by using that information, we can calibrate these fossil changes to produce a relative sea level reconstruction. So for every one of these samples, we can produce a data point. That's only useful if you know the timing of those changes. So the final stage is developing an age model. So radiocarbon dating is something that everybody will be aware of, and this is typically the main way of dating sediments. However, in reconstructions on the last 500-year timescales, there are limitations, and we end up with these plateaus where dates can cover quite a large age range and provide a limited chronological control. So in there we may add additional data, for example, pollen markers associated with things like the development of pine forests and the influx of plants such as Spartina. This is quite common on the south coast of England. Also, industrial events can leave markers. They can be quite localised, or we can get quite regional. This is the Chernobyl accident in 1986, and we see a cesium-137 spike in many sediments along the northwest European margin associated with that event. Tephra also provides another potential marker. Here's Margot working on our site in Iceland, and at the base of the sequence we've been working on, there's a very clear tephra horizon associated with an event in 1227. So we can put all that information together and develop an age model. This is using Bayesian statistics with a series of radiocarbon dates and some additional chronological control through this sequence. There's a number of ways you can do this, and Robin Edwards has a poster downstairs discussing some of these methods. So we can stick all this information together and produce a sea level reconstruction. Here's an example of some data sets where the sea level reconstructions have been compared to tide gauge data. It's a paper from Roland from Nova Scotia, a new paper we've just got in review at the moment from the Isle of Wight, where we compare it to the Newlyn record and Southampton and Portsmouth, and a series of data sets here from a recent paper by Roland and Phil looking at the timing of the inflection, but you can see they also match them with tide gauge data. So that's the approach that we take. So I thought what I'd do now is show you some of the highlights of where we now are in regards to this approach. So in AR4, we only had a limited amount of data included in the report. In AR5, Andy Kemp's now well-cited curve from North Carolina is in that data set. He shows a number of inflections associated with both accelerations and decelerations in sea level. This data has been used, as Jonathan Gregory alluded to, in semi-empirical models, for example, by Stefan Ramsdorff's group. However, this is starting to be slightly questionable as to the modes of those semi-empirical models. This is the data set from North Carolina, and in Quaternary Science Review this month is a new data set by Andy Kemp's group from New Jersey. And you can quite clearly see that the timing of particular inflections is quite different from the North Carolina record. So this assumption of the North Carolina record being closely correlated with temperature now starts to slightly fall apart, and as the number of records develop, this becomes clearer. I can see Svetlana dancing in the front. Yeah, I know you made a cut. Yeah. And I saw Andy at Palsy last week, and he was discussing the fact that he knows that these aren't reproducible. He has no problems with that at all. So this is Andy's data from New Jersey and North Carolina. This is a record from Florida that he's yet to publish, which he's allowed me to show. And these are our sites from Maine, Connecticut, Nova Scotia, and the Iceland core. The data sets vary slightly. These records all only contain foraminifera. These sites contain both diatoms and foraminifera. The small size of the errors here is a consequence of the diatoms constraining the elevation better than the forams do. The Iceland record only contains diatoms and some testate amoebae, and the Nova Scotia record is just forams. So there are differences in how those records are constructed, but the basic principles are the same. But critically, as we build up this information now, we're beginning to see that there is a contrast as you go up the eastern seaboard of the US. And it appears that the northern sites show greater variability in sea level in the last 600 years. There's a slight caveat to do with record length and number of samples in there, which we need to understand further. But I think this is becoming quite a sort of critical conclusion as we begin to build up these data sets. Now, I'm not, in this audience, remotely qualified to try and understand why the driving mechanisms of this are, but it's worth just pointing out that in this recent paper, along with many others, there's changes observed along the eastern seaboard in satellite data and in tide gauge data associated with dynamic ocean effects. The challenge we have as a community in understanding how this data set relates to our data set is tide gauge data can resolve interannual and decadal resolutions. And typically our data sets can only go from decadal to centennial signals. So we need to understand how these short-term processes can resolve some of our longer wavelength signals. So if we then broaden this out wider across the North Atlantic, this is a paper currently in review that I showed earlier, and we present our new Isle of Wight data. And in this paper, Anthony and the rest of us have been analysing the difference between these records from the eastern side of the Atlantic versus the western Atlantic. In red, we've just plotted the Church and White 2011 reconstruction just as a guideline from which to be able to compare the other records. And we most notably can see that the inflection along the eastern seaboard, it's not so clear here, there's a limited number of data points in Jeff Donnelly's curve. Our Connecticut one is yet to be published, is greater in magnitude than the inflection here on the eastern side of the Atlantic. And that replicates with what's seen in tide gauge analysis, for example, that Phil's done in the past. So we're quite confident that the salt marsh reconstructions can pick up these different signals spatially across the basin and also then provide us with information further back in time. If we expand this out further, we have a limited number of records from the eastern margin of the Atlantic which are in long length. I'm just going to show one here. There's a couple of others we're currently exploring. This is the North Carolina record. I've just replotted it for ease of comparison with our data. And these are two cores from Scotland. This is Loch Laxford. I showed the picture of that site. And this is another record from Carl of Tongue. And the reason we've got two records here is we want to show that reproducibility within this region. So, for example, individual data points such as this begin to be removed because we can then look at the overall trends. The other thing worth noting here is that these are the first long records to come from an uplifting coastal margin. So records such as the North Carolina data, the Isle of Wight data, come from coastlines where there's submergence. And therefore identifying accelerations against the background trend of already rising sea level is a challenge. And what we've done here is built these records in an uplifting coastal margin. This means that we don't get quite the same resolution. The sedimentation rate is quite a lot slower. But it does mean that we can take away this assumption about correcting for GIA, because we can assume that if we see an acceleration in sea level that is greater than the background rate of land uplift, then we would be able to identify it as a change in rate in this record. And there isn't a clear change in rate in this data set. We can see to an extent the recent acceleration, but much like the other data I've just showed you, it looks to be muted compared to the Carolina records. So what might be the driving mechanisms? Well, this is the figure from Jonathan and Ricardo's paper, which they have on a poster downstairs, where they take recent measurements of mass balance and produce these sea level fingerprint maps. And in particular, signals from things like the Arctic glaciers may produce an east-west contrast across the Atlantic. However, this is complicated by things such as gyre variations, and I was speaking to Chris Hughes about this, and I know he's going to talk about this later, is that the AMOC and variations in the ocean gyre may cause this variation across the Atlantic. And this is something that we really want to explore with communities such as yourself to understand further. We can see this in the Iceland record quite clearly. Margot's got this on a poster downstairs, so if you want any more detail, you can go and have a word with her about that. This is the NAO record from reconstruction from True et al., and this is the Iceland sea level curve. Anybody who may be aware of the Iceland data from the past, from a paper Roland did back in 2006, it showed an initial sea level rise and then a rapid acceleration. And the reason this has now changed is because we've added diatoms into that reconstruction, and we've also improved our chronological control. And as a result, we now see 3 periods of acceleration. It could be that these accelerations are associated with local GIA, but we've explored this and we don't believe the timings are correct. And so we've come to the conclusion that these 3 notable accelerations actually correlate with 3 main peaks in NAO, and that's quite a key driving mechanism of sea level in Iceland. Ivan Haig's done some modelling of this in regards to NAO signals in the tide gauge record, and that seems to be correlated there as well. So we can use the salt marsh data to understand spatial signals, but it's very hard to isolate those spatial signals, and it's also hard to separate which one's which. We can also use sea level data in the near field. This is some data set put together by Anthony Long and Sarah Woodruff from the Greenland margin, and they have 3 sites along the margin of Greenland, along the western side and the southern tip. And they've used exactly the same approach in small salt marsh sequences and produced a number of sea level index points. And they show this timing of this slowdown in sea level change. It's thought this slowdown may be associated with changes in mass balance of the Greenland ice sheet, though I know that that's currently being explored further because it is slightly hard to resolve. But we can use near-field data to try and correlate with our intermediate field sea level sites to understand the driving mechanisms. And we have another example of this in Alaska, where we've looked at mass balance of the Alaskan glaciers during the Little Ice Age and their impact on sea level change. So where do we go next with this work? We've got to a point now that the methodology is pretty well established, and the varying groups who are working on this are starting to converge in how we develop these records. There are assumptions behind these records, and that does have an impact, and we've explored that recently in a paper in Global and Planetary Change, and that's worth bearing in mind when reviewing any of these reconstructions. However, it's quite clear now from the body of information we have that salt marshes are able to act as tide gauges and identify changes in relative sea level, certainly on multi-decadal timescales. The challenge of interpreting them is the same as the challenges that have been discussed in regards to interpreting satellite and the tide gauge data. And we are getting to a point now that we need to work together with several communities to try and understand this further. There's also a push for proxy data, such as oceanographic data, that will allow us to understand the change in ocean over time. For example, there's a limited amount of data as to how the Gulf Stream has changed, but that is quite hard to correlate. We also need better understanding of the mass balance of the ice sheets. As was alluded to in some of the AR5 talks yesterday, we are starting to understand during the observational period, but prior to that it's difficult. And if we can do this, we could start working towards a point where we can understand late Holocene integration of ocean, atmosphere and ice sheet interactions. Thank you very much.